The new millennium of Japanese horror, kickstarted by Hideo Nakata's 1998 supernatural masterpiece Ring, helped revolutionize a much-needed change within the horror genre. In the last 20 to 25 years, it cannot be understated how crucial its impact was in inspiring a profound and poignant return to humanity's core relationship with fear, especially in the West, which shifted away from the slasher craze burnout dominant since the 80s and moved into the realm of the old-school supernatural. It has been long overdue since I've covered an Asian horror, the last one being Japan's Kiro, which was an utterly soul-destroying exploration of technological claustrophobia in an age of social disillusionment. Yeah, it is pretty heavy stuff, but that is what Asian horror does better than most other continents. Their scares are so intensely rooted within cultural values and traditions, and reacting to the moral and societal uncertainties of the time. However, today's topic can be seen by many as a very personal story, one that is so seemingly random and isolated that it conveys a piercing sense of intimacy, and will relate more to those who have experienced exactly what this mother and daughter are going through. Directed by Ring's Hideo Nakata, 2002's supernatural tale Dark Water tells the story of Yoshimi, a mother going through a messy divorce who ends up battling with her cold, manipulative ex for custody of her daughter Aikuko. After moving into a desolate apartment close to her daughter's new kindergarten and hunting for a new job that's a far cry from her former position at a major publishing company, Yoshimi becomes fixated on a mysterious water leak stemming from the apartment above, and soon both her and her daughter become haunted by a ghostly girl who seems to have taken a strange curiosity to them. Now, that is a lot to unpack, but before we get into it, I do want to address the tone of the story, because I personally don't hold Dark Water up there as one of the scariest J-horrors of all time, the same way I do Kiro, Ring, and Ju-on. At best, I find it eerie more so than scary, although fear is subjective, and I don't want to undermine some of the legitimately tense moments. At the very least, it lives up to being the most haunting depiction of water not set in the ocean. I just think for the purposes of expectation, it's probably more fitting to sell Dark Water broadly as a ghost story rather than a supernatural horror. Yet, at the same time, let's not get pedantic about genre. It's still a horror by nature, just not conventionally so. Ultimately, Dark Water is a family drama about a mother fearing for the future and safety of her daughter as she grows up in a time of unrest and uncertainty, while the supernatural threat exists more as a cautionary metaphor and heartbreaking extension to Yoshimi's fears. Later in the video, I will talk about the 2005 American Remake, but frankly, bar a few neat ideas on paper, it is a fucking bore to watch. It's somehow almost the exact same length as the original, clocking in at 1 hour and 45 minutes, yet manages to do far less and still overcomplicate a story that is incredibly simple to follow. As always, as we go along, make sure to leave your thoughts and requests in the comments below. And now, let's dive into the bittersweet tale of Dark Water. Perhaps the first thing you'll notice about Dark Water is the ubiquity of rain. It makes our protagonists seem trapped and isolated, even going as far as to feel overbearing and claustrophobic. While it could be said to foreshadow the inevitable supernatural threat, I actually think it's an interesting technique used in other J-horrors of the time, specifically Ju-on and Kiro, to relate the atmosphere to the emotional disposition of the characters. In the case of these examples, they convey different types of overcast. Ju-on goes for this eerie, lonely stillness as death inescapably latches onto its characters, while Kiro has a dark and brooding look to reflect this depressed alienation. In Dark Water, however, I feel it instills this unnatural feeling of chaos, as it becomes this persistent, overwhelming reminder of the messy situation the protagonists find themselves in. The reason why Yoshimi and her husband divorce is never fully explained, but it's irrelevant to the core conflict of the story. That is, he wants to take full custody of their daughter Aikuko because he is insistent that Yoshimi is unfit to care for her. But what makes this conflict so diabolical is that Yoshimi's ex exploits her mental illness as a tactic to favor his own defense by trying to manipulate her behavior out of context. At the beginning of the film, we learn that the ex is accusing Yoshimi of being psychologically unstable because she received psychiatric treatment and medication after basically suffering PTSD from her old job as a proofreader for sadistic and graphic novels. As such, this information essentially becomes the catalyst to the intense and unfair scrutiny Yoshimi is put under. For example, she ends up being frequently late to pick Ikuko up from school, which the ex claims is selfish negligence when really she was just rushing from a job interview, and later on she bursts out in uncontrollable anger at her ex for allegedly spying on her when she notices mysterious cigarette burns on the elevator door. The thing is, we know that last bit is true, but in the context of the situation, all her aggression does is reinforce the negative image her ex is trying to paint her as. As the audience, we are fully aware that her behavior is rational and justified because she's simply doing everything in her power to care for and protect her daughter, and all the supposedly unstable signs are natural extensions of the daily stresses she's under coping alone. Her ex is just aggressively gaslighting her and making her think she's crazy, and let's not forget, on top of all this bullshit, there's still a goddamn ghost we have to address. This is where many people will relate to the film in different ways. The whole first half tackles the emotional turmoil of being a single parent, trying to stay strong and hopeful for their innocent child who doesn't deserve the burden of being the center of a divorce. You really feel the strain in both Yoshimi and Ikuko as their relationship carries the entire film. The true fear we face comes from them being torn apart and losing each other, and it's only further exacerbated by the arrival of a ghostly girl. In a way, her appearances alongside the worsening leak in the ceiling actually helps symbolize the concept of the divorce, as it becomes this source of disturbance that's somewhat outside the character's control. It's just another problem that won't go away and comes up unexpectedly, and is potentially the very thing to tip Yoshimi over the edge. I'm going to argue this bit is thematically deliberate, but you almost kind of forget about the supernatural stuff when outside the apartment. Until the second half, it's pretty much background noise that only seems to come about when Yoshimi and Ikuko find a moment to relax. Both characters go through all this everyday stress on top of divorce, and just when they finally find some breathing room, like when they go to celebrate Yoshimi getting a job, this fucking ghost shows up and ruins everything. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the ghost now, but this will follow us through to the ending because it all comes together to make for a surprising and bittersweet payoff, so spoiler warning to those wishing to watch the film, and everyone else, brace yourself. So the ghost subplot as a mystery is pretty incidental, but its impact comes from how it manifests into this potential omen, while still acting as a symbol of Yoshimi's fears and anxieties developed from her own childhood. It's briefly explained that she was abandoned by her parents when she was her daughter's age, and so ever since she fears the same thing happening to Ikuko, thus we see her acting incredibly overprotective of her, while at the same time there are numerous match cuts and mirrored imagery to show how these relationships all relate to each other. The story behind the spirit girl called Mitsuko is that she lived in the apartment above Yoshimi and went to the same kindergarten as Ikuko, but one day went mysteriously missing after her parents abandoned her. The reveal is that Mitsuko drowned in the water tank on the roof of the apartment complex and her body was never recovered, thus explaining the dirty, contaminated water that went unchecked by the negligent superintendent. The whole idea is that this spirit haunts the apartment complex in search of a mother or someone to care for her after being forgotten for so long. Mitsuko attempts to drown Ikuko before Yoshimi rescues her, leading to Yoshimi having to accept being the mother of this spirit to end whatever curse has been left on the building. As such, empathizing with the spirit's situation as it mirrors her own childhood, Yoshimi sacrifices herself, leaving Ikuko alone for her father to take custody, confirming his own fears that Yoshimi would one day just abandon her. Now, if the film ended there, that would be a pretty bleak prophecy of a mother's fears being realised, yet thankfully the story continues. 10 years later, an older Ikuko returns to the now empty apartment complex and obtains clarity as to what happened to her mother all those years ago. It's discovered that Yoshimi never did abandon Ikuko. Her sacrifice was necessary to protect her from a spirit that was technically vengeful, and now as a spirit herself, she's still watching over and continuing to protect Ikuko, because once a mother, always a mother. It's a very tender and bittersweet conclusion that shows how love isn't always demonstrated in a happily ever after. Love can be shown through sacrifice by giving up her life or her time to ensure the peaceful future of her daughter. I respect that it doesn't make everything work out the way you and the characters want it to. After all, as a story about divorce, from what I've seen and read from others, it rarely ends in the most mutual of outcomes. However, on the topic of lacking a mutual outcome, I guess we should take a bit of time to talk about that American remake. Basically, it is more or less the same story, but as you might expect, without the soul or nuance that keeps you invested in the character's journey. For one, Jennifer Connelly does not look interested in being here, and her character, renamed Dahlia, lacks the heart and personality of Yoshimi's actress Hitomi Kuroki. Now, I do admire its attempts at trying to engage more with the mother's backstory by emphasizing an abusive father and alcoholic mother, yet fails to make it as meaningful as the original. For example, in the Japanese version, there's a scene where Yoshimi sees the kindergarten principal and teacher disciplining a child, and they angrily rebuke the child for crying, and it's clearly triggering to Yoshimi, which, unless I misunderstood the scene, I saw as an allusion to Yoshimi's troubled childhood without directly saying so. The remake, on the other hand, does the whole quick cut flashback shit instead of letting you work out details for yourself. Hell, there's a scene where the lawyer basically explains her entire backstory to her, just in case you couldn't work out what was going on. Atmospherically, they fucking nailed it, especially the water leak, which has a more toxic supernatural presence in the remake, but it's all let down by the drab and dreary storytelling. The delivery just feels shallow and inorganic, and for some reason it introduces all these characters performed by established actors no less, like John C. Reilly, Tim Roth, and Pete Postlethwaite, yet none of them are important to the story and are given far too much screen time with way too little material. In fact, they even add all these oddly specific details to their characters, like John C. Reilly being a gambling addict while Tim Roth tries to pretend he's a family man when I think it's implied he's also separated and living in his car, and then Pete Postlethwaite, who plays the negligent superintendent, ends up being arrested because it's suggested he was fully aware of the corpse in the water tank. Although, to give it the benefit of the doubt, I think I see what it's trying to do with showing how Dahlia is surrounded by all these incredibly incompetent, unhelpful people, and so she feels increasingly isolated and has to fend for herself. That's the thing, as a psychological thriller, it kinda works in places, like how Dahlia keeps thinking about her childhood, while the leaking ceiling becomes a stronger metaphor for her mental illness. You see, the original is super minimalistic in that it's not as explicit with its meaning, so the remake effectively simplifies certain things for mainstream Hollywood sensibilities, while still making other aspects far more convoluted than they need to be. And by convoluted, it really tries to heighten the scares, which are kinda blink and you'll miss them in the original, but that was the byproduct of most Hollywood remakes at the time. They just didn't trust audiences to have the patience for a touch of nuance. However, I do want to end on a positive note because, to be fair, the remake isn't offensively bad, it just doesn't help that I watched it shortly after the original. So after recovering the spirit's body, Dahlia actually tries to reconcile with her ex, who does show a hint of remorse, even willingly conceding that Dahlia is doing well with her daughter. I just like the idea of how it touches on the mother and father finding a healthy compromise for the sake of their daughter, but at the same time, it is very imbalanced how the remake decides to add more emphasis on the lawyer and building management, yet Dahlia's relationship with her ex is about the same as the original. All I'm saying is, it was a nice idea, but more of that time could have been used on developing the complexity of their divorce proceedings. Anyway, with all that said, those are my thoughts on Dark Water. If you have more insight and a different interpretation, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And until next time, send me some requests for future videos, stay safe, stay away from water tanks, and I'll see you all soon.